Hi, here we are in week 2, and we have sort of a new set of lectures for you. Um, Again, this is supposed to just be complementary to what you're reading, and so let me just kind of give you a brief talk today over interpreting the Gospels. Okay, interpreting the Gospels. You've been reading a lot about the hows and the various different aspects related to hermeneutics, which is a good thing to do, sort of laying that philosophical infrastructure for how this needs to be done. But sort of alongside that, I'd like to give you some practical observations as it pertains to particular genres in the New Testament and the Old Testament as well. Let's start with the Gospel. This will actually be a very short lecture, and but just to give you just a little taste of what you're looking at as it regards the Gospels and be able to put into practice some of these philosophical ideas that you have been looking at and learning about. Let me just start off by saying that the Gospels are a collection of narratives about the life and the ministry of Jesus. And in that, you find the content of Jesus' teachings. Those teachings are preserved in that genre, in those particular 4 Gospels we have in the New Testament. Essentially, they are examples of what we call ancient biography, rather than, say, myth or Jewish midrash, as some have suggested. As a result, they are intended to communicate, these Gospels are intended to communicate real events and promote real instructions for both the ancient and the modern reader alike. Now, the Gospels are different from the kind of narrative that we find, say, in Acts, because it not only contains a description of persons and their actions and certain events, but it also contains is the embodiment of the teachings of Jesus. And so you can see that it is different in that sense, that that's a distinction there. And so it's like a narrative like Acts, but different because it sort of is the embodiment of Christ's teachings. The Gospels are also different from, say, the epistles, because you say, okay, well, maybe they're more like the epistles because the epistles are the apostles' teachings. Well, it's different from that, too, because they do contain the apostles' teachings, but they were not, the Gospels were not actually written by Jesus, whereas the apostles were written, it contains their teaching, but it was actually written by them, whereas the Gospels contain Jesus' teachings, but they were written by the apostles. And so you can see this is just a very unique genre. That's the reason why they have a different name. We don't call them an epistle. We don't call it a historical book, though they are those. I mean, there are elements of those things. Although epistle actually means letter, and so not so much that, but in the sense that the epistle contains the apostles' teachings, we can see a connection there to the Gospels because they contain Jesus' teachings. But you can see that there's some differences, and it makes it a very unique genre of biblical literature. And so anyway, it warrants just a moment or two to consider certain things related to that will help you to properly interpret. Let's think about the historical context. And if you have printed off your notes there, this will help you follow along. The historical context. Now, this is something probably that will be emphasized across the board no matter what genre you're looking at, but it does need to be said here as well. You have to have a good grip on the era, the ethnic context that was taking place when those Gospels were written, the time in which Jesus lived and he ministered and so forth. You really need to have an understanding of what was going on there culturally and so on, historically. There's a number of sources that will help you to determine that. A good Bible commentary will usually lead with information like that. Bible handbooks or atlases, and there's a number of tools that you can use that are quite available to you these days that will give you that kind of information. What else about regarding historical context? What's the occasion of the narrative that you're reading? You know, is there something going on, that particular narrative that you might find in the Gospel, this particular story or narrative that you're reading? Was there something going on? What was the occasion for that? Sometimes the immediate context there in the passage itself will let you know what that is. Sometimes some commentary resources will give you some insights that maybe you wouldn't have had access to otherwise. These are very important things that will help you as you try to understand and interpret a gospel passage. And finally, as it regards historical context, you might ask the question, what was the context of the gospel writers themselves? What was their intention? This is a very important question. Why were they writing this gospel, right? What was going on? Were they trying to encourage Gentile believers, or Gentiles to believe that Christ was the Messiah, or Jewish readers to believe that Christ was the Messiah? What was it that was going on? What was the intention of the writer? This can give you some insight and help you to understand what's going on, help you to interpret the passage that you're working with. Okay, well, let's think about literary context. We've looked at some ideas and some principles for you regarding historical context. What about literary context? Let me ask you this, or let me encourage you in this way. Think horizontally. I'm going to recommend that you think horizontally. Now, what in the world do I mean when I say think horizontally? Do I mean for you to lay down on your couch and think? That's not what I mean. What I mean is to be aware of the parallel passages found in other Gospels. Okay? So we have 4 Gospels, don't we, in our Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You very well may be reading a narrative, a passage in the Gospel, and that passage, that narrative, is represented in one or several other of the Gospels. You need to be aware of those. You need to go and look those passages up in those Gospels, those other Gospels that we have in the New Testament, and read that in harmony with the passage that you're focused on. This will really help you. It'll give you some insights that you didn't have access perhaps before reading those other parallel passages. And so we don't want to ignore those or pretend like they're not there. We want to take them into consideration, and this will be a great aid to you as you strive to understand and rightly interpret a gospel, scripture, or passage. What else about thinking horizontally? When you're doing this, you're also taking note of certain distinctiveness that you might find in the various accounts. There's going to be certain features that will be present in one that won't be present in the other, and this is very helpful you to take that into account. If there were no distinctions among the different gospel accounts, there would be no reason to have 4. They'd just be unnecessary. It'd just be 4 identical books in the Bible, and that seems a little bit silly. And so we shouldn't be surprised that there's certain distinctions in these accounts that open up different angles and perspectives that we didn't have prior to taking them all into consideration. Also, too, when you're thinking horizontally, you're thinking and you're taking note of the different contexts of some of the parallel accounts and the different contexts that these narratives are placed into. And this can also give you some insights as well. And so that's some of the ideas that I'm wanting to encourage you with as it regards thinking horizontally. Okay? Not laying on the couch and thinking, but rather to think about the parallel passages in these other gospel accounts. All right, well, let's have you to think vertically then. If I've encouraged you to think horizontally, then surely I must want you to think vertically. What do I mean by that? That means to take into consideration both Jesus' context as well as the writer's context. Okay, take both of those contexts into consideration. Who the letter was written to and why, essentially, is what you're thinking about here. Who the letter was written to and why. And when you think about what the context of the writer was, whether it be Luke or John or whoever it may be, but you also realize that they wrote the gospel and it contains Jesus' teaching and it contains a narrative. And you can also think about what was going on, what was the context about what Jesus was doing, or so on and so forth, his context in that particular narrative. And you can consider both of those things at the same time, and that will be helpful to you and necessary to help you really get at an accurate and robust understanding of a particular passage in one of the Gospels. It will also help to explain certain distinctions that you do find in the Gospel accounts. I was telling you when you're thinking horizontally, you're going to notice some of these distinctions, and that'll be helpful. When you think vertically, this begins to perhaps maybe help you to understand why there's certain distinctions in the different accounts when you take these 2 different contexts, these 2 different perspectives, the writer and Jesus' perspective, into account. You're thinking vertically. Well, that's basically all that I have for you on the Gospels today. I told you it was going to be a short lecture, and so I kept my promise. Looks like just around 10 minutes or so. And so I hope this is helpful to you. There'll be a few other lectures here for week 2. Take note of those. Remember to contribute in that particular discussion thread as one of your weekly assignments. And so you want to do that. If you have any questions, as always, please feel free to contact me.